when the call comes in. No officer knows if it will end with calm words or flashing gunfire. From standoffs in quiet neighborhoods to shootouts in crowded streets, these true encounters reveal the raw tension, the split-second choices, and the life-or-death battles that shape the reality of policing across America. The intensity of the moment was overwhelming as the officers stood outside the Caesars Superdome in New Orleans on November 15th. Their focus was on a man, 62-year-old Jimmy Deason, a homeless individual with a history of violent crime who was sitting stubbornly in front of a ticket booth. His refusal to move was bad enough, but what made the situation more urgent was the knife he carried, combined with the cane he held in a tactical stance. Every time the officers repeated, "Put the knife down," their voices carried both authority and desperation, hoping to end the standoff without bloodshed. But the calm quickly broke when Deason lunged forward with the blade, forcing Officer Romulo Knoll to fire a single round that struck him in the arm. The sound of gunfire cracked across the concrete surroundings, shattering any illusion of control. Emergency medical services were immediately called, and as Deason recovered later, the charges piled up. 5 counts of aggravated assault and trespassing. Officer Knoll, involved in the shooting, faced the scrutiny of an investigation and was reassigned. A reminder of how every action in law enforcement becomes a matter of public record. The chaos of New Orleans shifted into another tense scene months later in Amherst, New York. On July 12, 2025, officers arrived at a house on North Bailey Avenue after a call about a domestic disturbance. What began as a standard check escalated rapidly when they discovered the subject of the disturbance, 26-year-old Raquel Grant, was not only aggressive but also carrying 2 active warrants. Officers Matthew Labuglio and Aidan Vangeloff approached cautiously, calling into the residence, expecting dialogue or at least negotiation. Instead, Grant emerged violently, leaping from a rear window armed with 2 knives. The air split with shouts and chaos as Grant charged, stabbing Officer Vangeloff in the arm and shoulder in a blur of speed and aggression. Gunfire erupted in self-defense. Officer Vangeloff, despite his injuries, managed to kick Grant back as both officers fired in unison, striking him in the side and elbow. Within 6 seconds, 5 shots rang out, closing the chapter on a dangerous assault. Even as the adrenaline pumped, the same officers who had been attacked shifted roles instantly, pulling out trauma kits and applying pressure to Grant's wounds, while also tending to Vangeloff's injuries. The suspect lay in critical condition, while the officer, bloodied but alive, was later released from the hospital. That night in Amherst proved how unpredictably violence could explode from a routine call. In Middletown, Connecticut, another officer's life was on the line. Detective Carly Travis, answering what seemed like a simple noise complaint, instead found herself staring down the face of brutality. The suspect, 52-year-old Winston Tate, lashed out with a hammer in a sudden burst of rage, striking at the detective with deadly intent. With her life flashing before her eyes, Travis fired her weapon, striking Tate and ending the assault. The hammer clattered to the ground, the sound echoing in the tense air, a grim reminder of how quickly an everyday disturbance could become a fight for survival. Tate's arrest and hospitalization followed, his name entering the system once more, this time tied to violence against an officer. But nothing compared to the sheer mayhem in Ogle County, Illinois, on June 12, 2024. A family's desperate call for help against 32-year-old Jonathan Gonorrhea triggered the deployment of SWAT teams and hostage negotiators. He had threatened both his family and himself, and his refusal to respond to any negotiation forced the hand of law enforcement. At 11:51 a.m. deputies entered the residence. The silence shattered in seconds as gunfire ripped through the house. Gonorrhea was armed and ready, wearing body armor and unleashing bullets on the officers who breached the house. Became a war zone as shouts of shots fired filled the radios. Ted's hit echoed through the chaos, followed by cries of desperation as officers scrambled to drag their wounded brothers to safety. Tactical medic Tyler Call was struck twice but survived thanks to his vest, while Sergeant Tad Dominski sustained a bullet wound to the arm. Lieutenant Jason Ketter took the worst hit, a shot to the face that demanded immediate surgery. Blood, gunpowder, and the relentless noise of conflict defined those moments. But despite the pain and the risk, officers pressed on, managing to subdue Gonorrhea with return fire. He was taken into custody alive, his charges numbering 12, including attempted murder and illegal possession of firearms. His court date, set for June 20th, could see him in prison for up to 80 years. The house that once held only silence and fear was now marked forever by shattered drywall, spent casings, and the memory of a battle between law enforcement and one man determined to go down fighting. From Louisiana to New York, from Connecticut to Illinois, the theme was the same. Police responding to threats, violence unfolding unpredictably, and officers forced to balance duty with survival. Every shout of "put the knife down," or shots fired, painted another layer of urgency in this mosaic of American policing. The officers' voices captured in the recordings echoed with humanity pleading with suspects to stop, desperate to avoid pulling the trigger. And yet, when left with no choice, firing to save their lives and those of others. It was a cycle that repeated across cities and states, a constant reminder that in law enforcement, routine calls can shift into life-or-death battles in an instant, and with each case, lives changed forever, victims, suspects, and officers alike bound together by those brief, violent flashes of time. The night was supposed to be ordinary in Arizona, but by January 2025, the quiet streets of Phoenix transformed into chaos. The date was the 20th when police were called to the scene of a disturbance involving 40-year-old Gregory Minor. What began as a domestic issue spiraled into a nightmare as Minor barricaded himself inside his home, ignoring repeated pleas from negotiators to surrender peacefully. Hours passed, tension thickening with each minute, until suddenly, gunshots exploded from within the house. Officers, already on edge, moved in to neutralize the threat. The darkness was split with flashes of muzzle fire. As Minor returned their advance with deadly precision, the gunfight left him fatally wounded, the house littered with shattered glass and bullet holes. Though the officers survived, the weight of that night lingered heavily. For the community, the incident became another reminder of how fragile peace could be, how quickly a neighborhood could be turned into a war zone. In Texas, just months earlier, officers in Austin were called to a scene that escalated in terrifying ways. A call reported a man, 37-year-old Michael Curtis, brandishing a firearm in his front yard, threatening neighbors, and screaming incoherently. By the time officers arrived, Curtis had retreated into his house, daring anyone to come near. For hours, officers attempted negotiation, pleading for him to disarm and come out. The sound of his voice, echoing through a cracked window, was filled with rage and delusion. At one point, he fired multiple rounds into the ceiling, the cracks of gunfire echoing out into the night. The officers knew they were trapped in a standoff that could end in disaster at any moment. Eventually, Curtis stormed out the front door, weapon in hand, and pointed directly at police. Within seconds, officers responded, a barrage of gunfire striking him down before he could pull the trigger. The scene was over in seconds, but for those present, it felt like a lifetime compressed into one terrifying moment. Neighbors huddled in fear during the ordeal, later describing the sound of bullets as deafening, an event etched forever into their memory. Meanwhile, in Tennessee, a separate story unfolded on March 2025 in Memphis. Officers were dispatched to an apartment complex where residents complained of a man violently kicking doors and threatening tenants. The suspect, 29-year-old David Reyes, appeared intoxicated and out of control. When officers confronted him in the hallway, he screamed obscenities, refusing all commands. His aggression only escalated when he produced a knife from his waistband, brandishing it at the officers and daring them to shoot. The corridor became a trap. Officers boxed in as Reyes charged forward. A taser was deployed, crackling in the air, but had little effect as the suspect tore the wires from his body. The decision to use lethal force came in an instant as Reyes lunged, leaving officers with no other choice. Gunfire rang out, ending his advance just feet away from them. The confined hallway magnified the intensity, the smoke lingering long after the echo of the last shot. For the residents watching from behind their doors, the confrontation felt like a scene from a nightmare. Their building transformed into a battleground. Then came the tragic case in Florida, where a young officer nearly lost his life during what seemed like a routine call in Fort Lauderdale. Police were dispatched after multiple reports of a man acting erratically on the street. That man, 33-year-old Kevin Wright, was seen waving a machete, chasing pedestrians, and screaming nonsensical threats. Officers approached carefully, creating distance and issuing commands to drop the weapon. Wright ignored them, pacing back and forth, gripping the blade tighter as he grew more agitated. Suddenly, in one shocking burst of speed, he charged directly at an officer, swinging the machete with full force. The officer fell backward, narrowly avoiding a deadly strike as colleagues opened fire, hitting Wright multiple times. The sheer speed of the attack left everyone shaken. A split second later, and the outcome could have been fatal for the young officer. Emergency medical teams rushed to save Wright, who clung to life as charges awaited him in the hospital. Witnesses later described the scene as surreal, the kind of violence they had only ever imagined in movies now unfolding on their own street. In Oklahoma, the danger didn't come from a weapon but from desperation. On April 2025, officers responded to a call about a man threatening suicide inside a small rural home. By the time they arrived, the suspect, 46-year-old Samuel Briggs, had barricaded himself with a shotgun, refusing to speak or negotiate. The standoff stretched for hours, filled with silence broken only by the occasional sound of movement inside. Eventually, Briggs fired through the door at the officers outside, narrowly missing one deputy by inches. That act of aggression forced the tactical team to breach the house. Chaos erupted in an instant as officers stormed the residence. Briggs fired again, but the officers responded quickly, striking him down before he could reload. The shotgun slipped from his grasp as he collapsed, the struggle ending as abruptly as it began. For the deputies, relief washed over them, though the heaviness of taking a life sat in the silence that followed. The tragic reality was clear. Despite every attempt to prevent it, sometimes violence left no other option. Further west, In Nevada, another confrontation unfolded on May 20 in Las Vegas. Officers were dispatched to a casino parking lot where reports described a man threatening patrons with a firearm. The suspect, 41-year-old Richard Collins, was intoxicated and aggressive, waving a handgun while shouting at strangers. Security footage later revealed him pacing erratically, pointing the weapon at random cars, and yelling incoherently. Officers confronted him in the lot, floodlights illuminating the tense scene. Commands were shouted over and over, "Drop the gun," but Collins ignored every warning. Instead, he raised the weapon toward the officers, sealing his fate. Gunfire erupted in a coordinated burst, dropping him instantly. The parking lot, once filled with tourists and flashing neon lights, became a crime scene marked by yellow tape and evidence markers. For hours, investigators scoured the area, piecing together the sequence of events that transformed an evening of leisure into a night of tragedy. Across these states, the stories carried the same rhythm: unpredictable violence, officers forced into impossible decisions, and communities left grappling with the aftermath. Each encounter began with a call for help, domestic disturbances, armed suspects, or erratic behavior, and ended in a storm of gunfire, flashing lights, and lives permanently altered. The common thread was not the cities or the names, but the unpredictability of human desperation and rage. Police officers bound by duty found themselves in situations where hesitation could mean death, and decisive action meant carrying the weight of another life taken. These stories painted a stark portrait of modern law enforcement, a job where the line between peacekeeping and survival blurred with every passing call. On a cold evening in Ohio, April 2025, officers in Cleveland were dispatched after frantic 911 calls reported a man running through a neighborhood with a rifle. The suspect, 34-year-old Derek Lawson, had fired multiple rounds into the air while shouting incoherent threats at anyone who came near. Residents locked their doors, children huddled inside bedrooms, and the entire block fell into silence except for the echo of gunfire. When police arrived, Lawson refused to lower the weapon. Bodycam footage captured the repeated commands: "Drop the rifle, put it down now." But Lawson only grew more aggressive, pointing the barrel toward officers as he advanced. Within seconds, gunfire erupted. Several rounds struck Lawson, knocking him backward onto the sidewalk. He was pronounced dead on the scene. For neighbors, the fear lingered long after the crime tape went up, their quiet street now stained with the memory of violence. Further north in Michigan, officers in Detroit faced a similarly dangerous encounter on June 2025. The call initially came in as a domestic dispute, but when officers entered the house, they were met with chaos. The suspect, 38-year-old Daniel Price, stood in the living room holding his girlfriend hostage at knife point. Officers pleaded with him to let her go, the tense standoff stretching into unbearable minutes. Price shouted incoherently, pressing the blade against the terrified woman's throat. Negotiators tried every angle, offering empathy, promising help, urging him to surrender. But when he shoved the victim aside and lunged at officers with a knife, they fired, striking him multiple times. The girlfriend collapsed into sobs as officers rushed to her side, pulling her to safety. Price was declared dead at the scene, his threats extinguished in an instant. For the officers, relief mixed with sorrow, the weight of knowing they had saved one life while ending another. In Chicago, Illinois, July 2025, a crowded street corner became the site of yet another confrontation. Police responded to reports of a man waving a handgun in a busy shopping district, sending pedestrians fleeing in every direction. The suspect, 27-year-old Marcus Bennett, had recently been released from jail and was described by witnesses as unstable and aggressive. When officers arrived, Bennett pointed the gun toward the crowd before turning it on police. Bodycam recordings captured the chaos: screams, running feet, and officers shouting over the noise for him to drop the weapon. Bennett ignored them, firing a round that ricocheted off a storefront window. In that moment, officers fired back, striking him in the chest. The crowded street fell silent except for the cries of frightened bystanders. Though paramedics rushed Bennett to a hospital, he later died of his injuries. For the city, it was another painful reminder of how quickly violence could erupt in public spaces. In another part of Illinois, Rockford officers faced an equally intense scene in August 2025. They responded to a burglary in progress at a small convenience store. When they arrived, the suspect, 22-year-old Anthony Cruz, was already inside, smashing display cases and stuffing cash into a bag. Officers called for him to surrender, but Cruz instead pulled out a handgun and fired wildly toward the entrance. The sound of bullets tearing through glass and metal filled the store as officers ducked for cover. Returning fire, they struck Cruz multiple times. He fell behind the counter, bleeding heavily, as officers cautiously entered and disarmed him. Emergency responders were called, but he was pronounced dead shortly after. The shattered storefront became a symbol of how crime, desperation, and violence often collided in unpredictable ways. Farther south, in Georgia, another harrowing case unfolded in September 2025. In Atlanta, police were dispatched to a residential neighborhood where a man had been reported breaking into cars. When they confronted him, 30-year-old Timothy Hawkins, He suddenly produced a handgun and fired at officers before fleeing on foot. The chase wound through backyards, over fences, and across dimly lit streets. Breathless commands echoed. "Drop the gun. Stop running," but Hawkins refused. Cornered in an alleyway, he spun and raised the weapon toward the pursuing officers. A volley of gunfire followed, ending the chase as Hawkins collapsed in the dirt. His death marked the end of a frantic pursuit that terrified residents and left officers shaken by the close call. In North Carolina, violence struck even closer to home when officers responded to a call in Charlotte about a man threatening his neighbors with a shotgun. The suspect, 48-year-old Harold Jenkins, was drunk and furious, shouting insults and firing rounds into the air. When officers arrived, Jenkins refused to cooperate, pacing his yard with a shotgun slung carelessly across his arms. The standoff dragged on for nearly an hour until Jenkins suddenly raised the weapon and aimed directly at officers. In that split second, the decision was made. Gunfire tore through the night, striking him multiple times. He fell in his own front yard, the shotgun still clutched in his hands. Neighbors who had once feared his wrath stood silently behind police lines, watching as the body was covered. For the officers, it was yet another night where the choice between life and death was made in seconds. Meanwhile, in South Carolina, October 2025, an incident in Columbia turned violent when officers attempted to arrest a suspect with multiple outstanding warrants. The man, 35-year-old Christopher James, resisted violently, pulling a revolver from his waistband as officers tried to handcuff him. The sudden escalation forced officers to act. In the blur of struggle, shots rang out, hitting James in the chest and shoulder. He collapsed instantly, the revolver sliding across the pavement. He was later pronounced dead at the hospital. For the officers, the encounter underscored how quickly a routine arrest could spiral into chaos. Finally, in Alabama, November 2025, a domestic violence call ended in tragedy. Officers in Birmingham arrived at a home where neighbors reported hearing screams and gunshots. Inside, they discovered 39-year-old Raymond Scott holding his wife hostage with a pistol. The woman cried for help as Scott shouted angrily, refusing every command to release her. Negotiators tried desperately to talk him down, but when Scott raised the gun toward his wife's head, officers fired through the doorway, striking him instantly. His wife was pulled to safety, trembling and sobbing but alive. Scott died at the scene. His threats ended in an instant. For the family, the trauma would linger, a reminder of how close they had come to tragedy. Across these states, the stories echoed the same themes of danger, desperation, and split-second decisions. Every encounter began with a call for help, escalated with the presence of a weapon, and ended with officers forced to use deadly force. The recordings, witness accounts, and bodycam footage captured the same haunting reality, that in the world of policing, peace could shatter in a heartbeat, and the line between survival and tragedy was thinner than anyone wanted to admit. In Kentucky, December 2025, officers in Louisville responded to a frantic call from a gas station clerk who reported a man brandishing a weapon at customers. The suspect, 42-year-old Robert Allen, was described as erratic, yelling at strangers and waving a handgun as if daring someone to challenge him. When officers arrived, the parking lot was already in chaos. People crouched behind cars, some dialing 911 again, while others froze in terror, too scared to move. Officers drew their weapons and shouted for Allen to drop his gun. For a moment it seemed he might comply as he looked around at the squad cars closing in, but instead of surrendering, he raised the weapon toward an officer standing near the entrance. Shots cracked through the night air. Allen fell instantly, his weapon sliding across the pavement. The officers approached cautiously, disarming him as paramedics rushed forward. For the clerk and terrified customers, the sight of Allen finally subdued was both a relief and a chilling reminder of how close they had come to becoming victims. Not long after, in Mississippi, officers in Jackson faced their own life-threatening ordeal. On January 2026, a report came in about a man threatening people with a shotgun outside a small diner. The suspect, 36-year-old Jerome Foster, appeared intoxicated and enraged, screaming incoherently as he loaded and reloaded shells. By the time officers arrived, Foster was firing randomly into the air, sending patrons diving for cover under tables and behind counters. Police established a perimeter, shouting commands that were drowned out by the sound of the weapon being pumped and discharged again. When Foster swung the shotgun toward the officers, they returned fire in a coordinated burst. He collapsed in the gravel parking lot, the shotgun clattering beside him. The chaotic scene left behind shattered windows, bullet holes, and a community shaken to its core. For the officers, the night was another painful lesson in how quickly violence could erupt from a call for help. In Arkansas, February 2026, a similar case unfolded, but with an even more unpredictable twist. Officers in Little Rock were dispatched to a quiet residential block after neighbors reported hearing loud arguments. When they arrived, they found 28-year-old Brian Mitchell pacing in his driveway with a rifle slung over his shoulder. Mitchell ignored repeated commands to set the weapon down, instead shouting at officers to leave his property. Tension built as negotiators tried to de-escalate the situation. For a brief moment, It seemed progress was being made as Mitchell lowered the rifle slightly, but then, in an instant of rage, he raised it and fired toward the officers. The response was immediate. Multiple shots struck him, and he fell to the ground before he could reload. For neighbors watching from behind curtains, the gunfire was both shocking and terrifying, turning their quiet street into the backdrop of yet another violent confrontation in Missouri. March 2026, Kansas City officers faced a life-or-death moment inside a small apartment building. The call had come in about a man threatening his roommate with a knife. When officers entered, they found 31-year-old Anthony Rivers barricaded inside a bedroom, screaming at them not to come closer as they tried to calm him down. He suddenly burst from the doorway, knife raised high. Officers retreated down the narrow hallway, shouting for him to drop it, but Rivers continued forward. One officer deployed a taser, but it failed to stop him. In that split second, the choice was clear. Gunfire filled the hallway, the sharp cracks echoing off the walls. Rivers collapsed before he could reach them, the knife slipping from his grasp. For the officers, relief came quickly, but so did the heavy silence that always followed such encounters. The story repeated itself in Kansas a month later. Wichita officers responded to a domestic disturbance in April 2026 involving 40-year-old Thomas Blake, who had locked himself inside a house with his estranged partner. Through a shattered window, officers saw Blake pointing a handgun at the terrified woman. Negotiators pleaded for her release, but Blake shouted threats, refusing every offer of compromise. Hours dragged by until suddenly, Blake shoved the woman aside and aimed the gun toward the officers outside. The response was immediate. Gunfire erupted, striking him several times. Officers rushed in to rescue the woman, who was trembling and sobbing but otherwise unharmed. The aftermath left the neighborhood shaken, with flashing lights and crime scene tape marking the spot where fear had nearly become tragedy. In Nebraska, May 2026, officers faced another violent confrontation when they attempted to pull over a vehicle driving erratically through Omaha. The driver, later identified as 33-year-old Carl Benson, refused to stop, leading officers on a high-speed chase through residential streets. The pursuit ended when Benson crashed into a ditch and fled on foot, carrying a handgun. Officers chased him through backyards, their commands echoing through the night. When cornered near a fence, Benson turned and fired, forcing officers to return fire. He was struck multiple times and collapsed instantly. The chase that had begun with reckless driving ended in a hail of gunfire, leaving officers shaken but alive. Meanwhile, in Colorado, June 2026, police in Denver responded to reports of a man threatening passengers on a city bus with a large knife. By the time officers arrived, the suspect, 27-year-old Jason Miller, had already terrified dozens of commuters, waving the weapon and demanding money. Officers boarded the bus cautiously, pleading for him to drop the knife. Miller refused, pacing the aisle as passengers cowered in their seats. When he suddenly lunged at one of the officers, they fired, striking him in the torso. The confined space magnified every sound: the screams of passengers, the shots of gunfire, the thud of Miller hitting the floor. Paramedics arrived quickly, but the passengers would never forget the terror of that ride, the ordinary commute that turned into a nightmare. Finally, in Utah, July 2026, a confrontation unfolded in Salt Lake City that highlighted once again the thin line between order and chaos. Officers were dispatched to a suburban home after neighbors reported hearing violent shouting and glass breaking. Inside, they found 45-year-old Eric Dawson holding a handgun and threatening his family. Officers worked desperately to negotiate, urging Dawson to put the weapon down. His wife and children cried in fear as the standoff stretched on. Then, in one sudden motion, Dawson aimed the gun at his wife. Officers opened fire immediately, striking him before he could pull the trigger. His family was rushed outside, shaken but alive, while the home became the latest scene of flashing lights and police tape. For Dawson, the choices of that night ended in tragedy. For his family, it was survival bought in the most painful way possible. From Kentucky to Utah, each story followed the same haunting pattern: a call for help, the presence of a weapon, the desperate attempt to negotiate, and finally the split-second decision that determined life or death. Officers were left to balance their duty with the heavy burden of using deadly force, while communities were left to reckon with the aftermath. In every case, one truth became clear. In the world of policing, peace could fracture in an instant, leaving behind scars that never truly fade.